Hello friends, Still Young here, developer advocate at Sitecore. Today I have a sneak peek at my Sitecore Symposium 2022 presentation in Chicago on developing with the Engagement Cloud. I'll be showing a live demonstration of a proof of concept that I've been working on related to a new developer experience working with Sitecore CDP and Personalize. This POC is still in its infancy, but demonstrates how you can use APIs of this product to facilitate deployments to your tenants using source control. So let's go on in and check this out. All right, so before we jump into our live demonstration on the proof of concept that I created, I just wanted to walk through a couple different slides that talk a little bit about what I was trying to achieve with my proof of concept. So on this slide, I talk a little bit about the APIs that exist within the product. There are the well-known ingestion APIs if you've been working with CDP or Personalize before. These APIs are how you ingest guest profile information into either CDP or Personalize. So what is not often talked about is these management APIs. These APIs allow you to create connections, delete connections, update different connection information, as well as decision models, flows, templates, etc. So if you wanted to create a web experience template, or in this topic, we're going to be creating a decision model or a decision template, then these APIs essentially allow you to do that. Now, these APIs currently exist from within the tenant. And so when you log into the tenant, there is a bunch of actions that take place asynchronously while you are interfacing with that tenant. But these same APIs can be called directly as long as you have authentication handled, which we're going to cover authentication and how you authenticate to these APIs, as well as how to interact with them. But the long story of where we're trying to get to is not necessarily the APIs, but also trying to get to a new way of doing development for Sitecore CDP and Personalize. And so what I want to get to with this proof of concept is what I'm showing on the screen. I want to be able to use source control where a developer can work locally in their local environment, create their decision template, create all the configuration related to that template, and then check that change in, go through the proper process. If they're creating a feature branch or whatnot, they can then do a proper PR process, have it peer reviewed by the team, and then based on that, have that go through a typical CI/CD process. Now on the screen, I use GitHub in a lot of cases as a reference point, but this does not need to be just GitHub. This could be done with Azure DevOps. This could be done with any other CI/CD or source control system. Some other benefits to this approach versus the alternative approach is that now you can do more testing along the way. So if a developer is using or creating some JavaScript code locally, they can now create unit tests based on that. In a lot of my cases of what I'm going to be showing here today or in my symposium presentation is I've used Mocha tests to do the unit testing locally, but it's up to the developer to decide what tools and how they want to do unit testing and or automation testing. So this flow now enables the developers to have a little bit more control and a little bit more ability to check and confirm that the code that's being written by developers is written in a good way, that you can also do linting and other things to make sure it's in a format that a developer the quality that the development team is expecting. And so now that can funnel back into your CDP and Personalized tenants. So let's just talk quickly about our different repositories that we have that I'm going to be walking through specifically today. Both of these repositories are open source. So you can go out to them today and start using them for your own use cases. But it's important to note that they're not fully baked out yet. They need still more work because they're open source projects. There is the Serializer tool. The Serializer tool is basically the brains of the operation that handles all the kind of wrapping of the APIs that take place. So then you can just run simple commands in a command line interface to push changes out to a tenant or pull things from a tenant, whatever the case may be. There is also a specific deploy command that we're going to be using today, which basically takes physical files that exist in source control or on a local machine somewhere, packages them up, and then deploys them out to a tenant using all the different logics that are built into that serializer application. The examples repository is the repository that you would use if you were going to create and start using this process. So this is set up as a GitHub template that allows you to then create new repositories from that. This one shows examples of how you could do unit testing with Mocha, automation testing with Supertest, but these are just examples. So you don't have to follow this exactly. You don't have to use the Serializer tool. If you like this idea, you could go out and build something yourself to wrap those APIs. Also, this all uses GitHub Workflow to show how you could use the CI CD process to deploy these out to your tenants on check-in, which we're going to demonstrate today. But you don't have to do that. Like I said, you could use Azure DevOps to do that instead. So now that we've covered that, let's go on and check out the live demonstration.
Hello friends, it's Dylan here. I hope you're enjoying today's content, but please don't forget to subscribe. That way you don't miss out on any of the future upcoming content that we're releasing on other Sitecore topics. Also, if you haven't done so already, you should definitely like this video. This helps others find the video in the YouTube algorithm. And so with that, thank you, and let's get back to the video.
All right, so now that we're starting out the demo, I wanted to just talk through the repositories real quick before I got into any of the specific details of running through the steps of running our live demonstration. So on the screen right now, we have on the left, we have the Serializer repository, and then on the right, we have the examples repository. And so on the left, we'll start there first. This is currently going to be an open source repository. Right now, it's not technically open until probably Symposium, once I have a few more scenarios built out. But the Serializer, as previously mentioned, is the brains of the operation that basically takes any of our example repositories, anything that you've built out, and deploys those out to a tenant. And so it kind of takes physical files, packages them up, and then converts that over to API requests that sends that data over to the tenant. So I just want to walk through a few different things that are in this repository, especially for those that want to modify this repository to add additional scenarios. I just want to talk through a few things. So if we open up the source folder, and inside this folder, there is a commands folder. And inside this commands folder is basically representing the different CLI commands that you can run for the Serializer application. There is the API folder, which represents wrapping of code around the APIs that you would request out to. And then there's the deploy command, which is, like I said, the magical command that you run that packages up everything, runs a bunch of different API commands to deploy those out. So if I jump into API real quick, there's a few things I've built out already. One I'll walk through real quick is the auth. So to authenticate, that's the first step that you'll run through whenever you're using the Serializer tool. You'll do an authentication first to authenticate to the tenant, and then you can run different APIs, or you can run the deploy command. And so we'll take a look at the service real quick. And so what you see is basically a bunch of functions that do different things. So there's an authenticate method. This does all the magic of authentication, calls out, does a kind of a fetch out to the service endpoint of v2 OAuth token to get back, basically the long story short is you're passing in a client ID, a client secret for client credentials grant type, and you're getting back a access token that then you can use thereafter for additional requests. Now, the way it works with the Serializer is it uses something called config store. Config store allows it to kind of create temporary files no matter where it's running. So if it's running on a CI/CD agent to build, it could store these temporary files, which would store the access token it needs. So it can basically store that information then for any additional requests until the access token expires after 10 minutes is what the rules are. There's a few other things that are stored in those kind of temporary files. The other thing is that's important to store is when you specify the authenticate, you specify a service region. So a service region is, US, East Europe, and APJ. So those are, once you pass those in, then it knows, based on those values, it knows which APIs to call. So that's pretty cool. One other one I'll take a look at real quick is templates. Template service in here is basically some of the ones I've built out already. And this, again, it's just giving you the functions to call into the API for getting templates. This is just calling v3 templates. It gets back an object, you pass in a bearer token of the access token that you got back from that off call, and then once you got that, then it can make additional requests there, and it just returns information depending on your needs. The deploy command, if you look at that real quick, and one other thing I'll note about these as well is they have a function near at the top, which are all the different types of commands that do all the magic under the hood. But there is also the kind of init deploy commands. This is used for Commander, basically facilitate the CLI. This is obviously a Node application, a Node CLI application. So the bottom is the stuff related to how you call it, and then it calls an action deploy, and then that calls this function at the top. And that function at the top basically takes in an artifacts path. It has it defaulted to /artifacts, which we'll see when we look at the examples repository, how that is at /artifacts, but you could change it to something else if you want. If you are adding this to a Sitecore project where you have other things going on in that repository, then you could change the path to be something more specific. You could be like CDP Personalize or something like that, or CDP artifacts or something along those lines. And then you could pass it in, and then there's essentially a command here. There's a utils, which is where all the real crazy magic happens, and that is where it's basically like deploy templates is calling a function in this file. So this file has all the kind of combining of the physical files that are inside that examples repository, combines them all together, builds a JSON object, and sends that JSON object to CDP or personalized tenants. So let's jump on over, now that that's, I think, mostly cleared up how that works. Let's jump over to the examples repository. So let's talk about a few things that are in here. Now, there's a lot of things that are in place that are really provided as examples of how you could do it. So first thing that you'll notice is that there's some configuration for Mocha. So Mocha is just the unit test framework that I'm using to do unit testing locally. So what's great about this is if you want to do unit testing with the code that you're writing for a decision model or a decision template or a web experience template, then you can actually wrap those with Mocha tests. And I'll show, I don't have a perfect example, but I can show kind of the syntax of that. So you can see we're using Mocha, Chai, and super test. Let's take a look at some of the things that are in here. So tests first, it's just how you would run Mocha tests if you were using a standard JavaScript application. You'd have an npm command where you can run npm test or npm run test, and this would run a Mocha test. All your Mocha tests that you have defined, your Mocha configuration is here. And so this just defines where the paths to those files are. And like I said, Mocha is not the only option here. You could rip out Mocha and put in Jasmine or some other unit testing framework that you want to use instead. So let's jump on into the artifacts folder. This is where all our configurations live. These are the configurations that we're deploying out to our tenant. And so inside of this, we've only really got templates, a few different types of templates currently working. The two types that work as of right now is decision templates and web templates, web experience templates. So if we open up decision, the way this works is that There's basically per decision template, you're going to have a folder that represents the contents of that decision template. So we have one called get number of events. If we open up that, the deploy command will come up and basically pick up that folder, see the contents of it, package up all the contents of this folder into one JSON object to basically create or update this template in our tenant. An example is we have a config.json. This has just the basic configuration of our decision template that we have. And so you can see it's got name, it's got a few other fields, the type that it is, status of it. I've added a tag of source control. So if you want to kind of dictate what is being source controlled and what is not, then that's a way you can do that. You can specify a few other fields here. And then one of the cooler things about this, I think the benefit of doing it source control versus in a tenant is that you can separate the file of the JavaScript file separately. So basically what happens is that there's a template elements that exists in this JSON file when it needs to run that in the tenant. When it runs that command to update or create it, it needs to pass a template elements element or attribute. The way it's set up in here is the deploy app basically handles that for us. So all we need to do is actually create a file.js file. And it's got, right now it has to be called file and then .js. Unfortunately, that's just the way I have it configured. But now we can write our decision templates right here in Visual Studio Code, which is pretty cool. Another thing is with Mocha tests is I've actually created a unit test, although it doesn't do anything really. It just returns true as of right now. But you can now create unit tests for the JavaScript files that you're writing. These would run before it deploys to the tenant in the case of a CI/CD process, or you could run these locally. So as you're building these out, or as a developer working on these, you can create a bunch of unit tests for this file, and then future developers that are working on it, it would essentially block them from checking or getting this into their tenant without it. If it's failing for some reason, it would not make it into a tenant without it passing the unit test. So that's kind of a useful benefit to this approach versus using it in the tenant process. So that's pretty cool. I wanted to show web templates real quick because I have, obviously if you have more configuration, obviously in this case with the web experience template, you usually have a JavaScript file, you have the CSS, you have the HTML, and you also have the free marker syntax as well. So this is all represented here. Another thing that you'll note in this that's a little different is I actually use YAML instead of JSON. So this YAML works as well. Obviously, I had to build that in, but if you are more familiar or more comfortable with YAML syntax, which comes with the ability to comment and stuff like that, there's some benefits to using YAML over JSON, especially since the reason why we're doing this is to make it super easy to edit. So you can do it the same way, but just a little bit easier to read in YAML format. And then you can specify the CSS, same as you would if you were doing this directly within the tenant. You can still use the handlebar syntax. It does sometimes cause errors, little highlighted errors. I still haven't figured out a good way to handle that. Also, one lacking feature here is you don't really get the preview that you would get from the tenant as you would here. I thought about building an extension for Visual Studio Code to maybe add in that functionality. But obviously I haven't done that yet. And then here's the free marker syntax. So you can just use a extension of FTL. I'm not sure if that's kind of a free marker syntax from what I could understand. So that's the syntax or the extension you have to use if you're specifying any API definitions. And I've noticed that you don't have to provide these if you pass into that template elements only the config in a JavaScript file, that it won't cause any issues with that in the web experience inside the tenant. So actually, let me show one last thing, which is the GitHub workflow that I have set up. So this is what I'm going to run through when I run through the actual CLI kind of commands. When we commit changes, basically the way it works is if you commit changes to main or release branches, then it will basically run through this step. The environment is UAT. This is where our client ID and secret are stored for the authentication method, which is important to note because you don't want to store those directly in here because then everybody can see them. But basically it does a checkout, does a setup of node, it does installs and runs those tests that I was referring to. And then we run the authenticate to CDP Personalize. And so basically, like I said, this is just running that NPM package that we have and telling it to log in the user. And then it passes in the secrets that we have stored in our environment. And then lastly, we just run a deploy command, and I'll show that as well coming up in a second. So let's jump on over to the actual, take a look at that next. All right, so now that we've walked through a little bit of the repositories and what's in the source control, I wanted to do two different demos. The first one I'm going to show is just the simple CLI commands that you can run using your local machine. So the first one I'm going to run, and just before I get started on that, I wanted to note that I'm in my examples repository. So this is important for the last one I'm going to run, but the first one I'm going to call is an npx Sitecore CDP Serializer, and I'm going to call an auth login. And so just to detail what's here, I've obviously hidden the keys here, but I'm authenticating against the partner sandbox. And so I'm passing in, I'm running the npm package Sitecore CDP Serializer, and I'm passing in an ID, which is the client ID, and then I'm passing in a secret, which is the API token from that tenant. And then the last thing I pass in is a -L, which represents the location or the region of that tenant. And in this case, I'm passing it to EU, which represents the app.boxever.com or the equivalent of the European Union or region for that data center. So if I run this command, you'll notice that it's now said token stored for future uses. So one thing that we can do, and obviously I've built all this, so these are just helpful things to see, is you can run an auth status. And this will just show you your access token that you've got created. And so this is the access token. Now, one thing that this does not do is it doesn't authenticate or it doesn't verify that this access token is still valid. So this just shows you what's in our temp files in the config store that we're using. This also tells you the service URL that it's using based on the EU variable that we passed in. So it's using api.boxever.com. All right, so the next command I'm going to run is another command that could be helpful, depending on your use case, is you can actually log out as well. So it's got basic functionality here. So as you can see, it's successfully logged out of our tenant. And so it's killed that access token. And now in order to run these next commands, we have to re-authenticate because I need to be authenticated to do those. So I'll just run this command again. And so now you see that it's stored that token again. So there's two last requests I want to make. The npx Sitecore CDP templates is another one that I've built out. And so what this does is it goes out to the tenant and pulls back all the templates. Once that's run, the coolest one that's left is the one that we would run if we were doing a CI/CD process, which we'll show next, which is the deploy command. And like I previously mentioned, this will bundle up all our items that exist inside this examples repository. It will bundle up all of the artifacts that are in that artifacts folder and then deploy those out to a tenant. And so that's what we'll run. And as you can see, it's saying there's no differences found between a bunch of the different templates that found in that examples repository. And so therefore it didn't deploy anything. And so that's pretty much it for this demonstration. All right, let's jump on over to the CI/CD demonstration. All right, so now that we've walked through how to do the CLI demo and how that all works, I wanted to basically do a CI/CD deployment using the examples repository to deploy out to the partner sandbox. And so what I want to do is I'm actually going to make a change to one of the configurations that we already have, and then we'll just see how that looks once we go through the process of committing these changes and then pushing them out to our GitHub repository. And then that should trigger off, as long as we're pushing it to the main or release branches, that should trigger a CI/CD process to do the test, which we don't have any tests that are valid here, or it would also then go and deploy those changes using this workflow that we have defined for GitHub. So I'm going to actually go into the get number of events item, and I'm going to go into config, and I am going to add another tag just to show that this live demo now. Guess I already have one in there. I don't think I do. And I'll save this, and then I'll go ahead and I'll chuck this in for this branch, which we're in the main branch, so it should fire as soon as we commit this and push this. So we'll just type in a simple message. I'll just call this live demo, and then I'll commit that change. And this won't fire it yet. I need to still push this change into my remote repository. And so then I'll click on sync changes, which will then push this off. And so now I'll close this window and I'll open up my browser. And first you'll notice I'm in my tenant. This is the partner sandbox, as I previously mentioned. I can quickly go over to the decision templates. That's what I'm deploying here. And you should see that I have, I believe it was either this one or this one. I couldn't remember exactly which one I changed, but all four of them, the four that I have defined in that repository, are all set to only having the tag of source control. And so now we'll jump back to my GitHub repository. So this is my GitHub repository. It is a public template, so anybody can go and create a new template from that. I'll go over and check out my actions. These are my CI/CD deploy actions. And you'll see that I have one running because that was just triggered, it says 18 seconds ago. So let's take a look at that real quick. Actually, by the time I clicked it, it had already finished. So let's just see what it did. And so we'll click on that build and deploy task that we have. And so you can see some of the steps it went through to run this process. And the most important one is just this authenticate process, the authenticate. So it just runs npx Sitecore CDP Serializer off login, and because it's passing that value from something we have stored as the kind of owner of this repository, no one can see these kind of hidden values of the ID and secret. And so it's doing the same thing as what we were doing using the CLI earlier. And then lastly, the deploy action here is basically the same output as we were seeing before in our CLI. So now we should find, if we go back on over to our tenant and do a refresh, that now we have our 4 templates that we have from our local repository. But now we have this get number of events now shows the tag that we just changed in source control. So basically this is handling updates. In this case, we could have created a new template and then had it deploy that one as well. That process also works. So it can be a create or an update. But that's pretty much it for today's demonstration, a sneak peek at my Sitecore Symposium 2022 in Chicago presentation. And until then, I'll see you next time.